The real price of manifest destiny, when a wagon was worth more than a life. The American West. The phrase conjures images of boundless freedom, gold in the rivers, and the courageous spirit of the pioneer. It was a vision gifted to the nation by politicians and preachers, the divine right to conquer a continent, manifest destiny. But what the history books often forget to mention is the fine print, the brutal, unforgiving ledger of the Oregon Trail. We were told the price was sweat. The terrible truth is that the price was measured in life, and often a single life was deemed less valuable than the wooden axle it relied upon. Section 1. The Illusion of Value. In 1845, a good Conestoga wagon and its team of 4 sturdy oxen represented a fortune. It was a mobile savings account, worth nearly $1,000 in land claim fees and supplies, the lifeblood of a family's future. The journey itself was a mechanical problem. 2,000 miles of wear and tear, and only 120 days to solve it before the lethal winter snows sealed the mountain passes. This is where the morality of the East collapsed. Our protagonist, Thomas Hale, a cooper who joined the Oregon train of 45, learned this truth at the test of the Platte River. The river, a wide, murky beast of a mile, hid quicksand beneath its deceptively shallow surface. Senator Thorne, a man whose wealth was his god, ignored Captain Jedediah Stone's warnings. He drove his magnificent, overladen wagon, a shrine to Eastern luxury, straight into a quicksand trap. The wagon immediately listed, and his prize oxen sunk up to their chests. The disaster wasn't the loss of the wagon, it was the cost-benefit analysis that followed. Jedediah Stone, the captain, ignored the senator's screams of distress. He shouted only one command: save the team. Cut the axle if you must, but save the beasts. Why? Because the ox was the fuel for 40 people, not just one. The value chain was ironclad. No ox equals no wagon. No wagon equals loss of supplies. Loss of supplies equals collective starvation. To lose one of Thorne's oxen was to compromise the security and speed of the entire train. The senator, whose life was only his own, was expendable. His animal was not. They hauled the oxen out. They watched as the senator's velvet-lined boxes and silver sank into the Platte water. His humiliation was absolute. His material value reset to zero. The river had drowned the illusion of his eastern superiority, replacing it with the cold, hard logic of the frontier. Section 2. The Inevitable Sacrifice. This logic was tested further in the desolate stretch of the Great Basin, where famine stalked the pioneers. This stretch brought the most chilling manifestation of manifest destiny's true cost, where Thomas Hale faced his personal breaking point. His mule, Goliath, had carried his entire future. His tools, his rifle, and his last small bag of precious seeds. But the grass had failed. Goliath was starving, and Thomas knew the rule without anyone speaking it. He had to put down the only living thing that had been with him since Cincinnati. Goliath was his engine, his companion, the very extension of his dream. But the mule could no longer stand. It was a burden that threatened the speed of the remaining vital animals. Thomas Hale, the cooper, walked to his friend and executed the harshest law of the trail. The unnecessary must be eliminated to ensure the survival of the necessary. But the story doesn't end there. The final brutal sacrifice followed. The mule, the physical embodiment of Thomas's ambition, was not left for the wolves. It was skinned, butchered,
and its tough, bitter meat was distributed to the starving children of the wagon train. Think of that image. The pioneer consumes the very means of his progress. He eats his own dream to continue the journey. In that moment, Goliath's life, Thomas's capital, and his entire financial independence were transmuted into the raw, desperate calories required to cover the next 10 miles. Section 3. The Enduring Scar. The real price of manifest destiny was not just the physical loss of life, but the complete moral inversion of value. The trail taught one lesson above all. Life is not sacred on the frontier. Capability is. A man's worth was not his name, but his utility to the group. The senator, stripped of his wagon, was relegated to digging latrines. The mule, though mourned, became essential sustenance. The individual dream of wealth was broken down into the collective necessity of survival. Thomas Hale walked out of the Great Basin a different man. He was scarred, stripped of every luxury and possession, but he carried a new wisdom. He learned to value a strong axle over a velvet couch, and the shared burden of a rope over the lonely pride of a single man. This brutal, uncompromising reality of the Oregon Trail is the true, untold price America paid for its westward expansion, and only those who accepted this merciless exchange would live to see the Promised Land.
The Unforgiving Trail, a Western Chronicle. 1. The Siren Call of the West. The year was 1845, and the scent of coal smoke and river silt lay thick over Cincinnati, a perpetual fog of industry and burgeoning civilization. To Thomas Hale, a journeyman cooper whose hands were perpetually stained with oak tannins and sweat, the Ohio River City was not the Promised Land. It was a cage of cobblestone and routine. At 26, Thomas was already a man etched by the demands of his trade, his shoulders permanently bowed from lifting heavy barrel staves, his palms calloused to the texture of dried leather. He lived in a small rented room above a chandler's shop, its window overlooking a narrow alley where the city's refuse collected, breeding a stench that no amount of spring rain could wash away. His life was a neat, suffocating row of ledgers, 7 days of labor to earn enough for rent, meager food, and a small, hopeful saving tucked inside a worn copy of the Holy Bible. He was a good worker, honest and reliable, the kind of man who would one day own his own shop, marry a respectable girl from the church, and pass his life within the same 10 square miles. That was the American dream, as defined by the East. But Thomas was restless. He felt the weight of that predictable future pressing down on him, a barrel lid screwed on too tight. His escape came not in the form of drink or dissipation, but in paper. Every Tuesday, when the newspapers arrived from the printing office, Thomas would purchase a copy, not for the politics or the market reports, but for the one column that set his soul on fire, reports from the Missouri frontier. They spoke of the Oregon Territory, of lands where the soil had never known a plow, where timber grew so tall it seemed to kiss the clouds, and where a man could carve out an empire with nothing but a rifle and a determined heart. The language of the papers was intoxicating, laced with words that hummed with a fierce promise. Manifest destiny, unclaimed bounty, freedom from bondage. These were not just articles, they were a siren call, amplified by the booming voices of politicians and preachers. They whispered of a grand, inevitable future, a vision so wide it swallowed up the cramped existence Thomas knew. 1,000 acres for the taking, Thomas,
his friend Arthur Miller had once scoffed, wiping flour from his apron. Arthur was a baker, a sensible man whose only ambition was a bigger oven. And 1,000 miles of dirt and sickness to cross to claim it. Fool's gold, I tell you. Thomas had only nodded, but the words had already taken root. 1,000 acres. His small rented room had begun to shrink around him, the city noise turning from a familiar background hum into a frantic, mocking chatter. The cooper shop, with its ceaseless rhythm of hammering and planing, felt like a coffin being built for his own ambition. His dream had a name, a valley in the Willamette, where the seasons turned in a softer, more generous cycle than the harsh Ohio winters and humid summers. In that place, he imagined, he would be a landowner, a pioneer, the first generation of something new, not the endless continuation of something old. The decision didn't arrive in a single dramatic lightning strike, but in a slow, relentless erosion of his contentment. It was the lack of space, the crushing sense that every opportunity was already claimed, every furrow already plowed, every great deed already done. The true breaking point arrived on a frigid morning in late January. Thomas was hauling a wagon load of finished pickle barrels across a mud-slicked street when a coach, bearing the crest of the city's wealthiest merchant, splashed a torrent of cold brown sludge across his face and clothes. The driver, fat and indifferent, merely flicked his whip and drove on, leaving Thomas shivering, humiliated, and utterly insignificant. Standing there, dripping filth and cold, the future Arthur Miller had described, the small shop, the respectable wife, the 10 square miles, suddenly looked less like security and more like a tombstone. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, the mud mixing with the water in his eyes, and a slow, fierce determination solidified in his gut. That evening, he didn't go to the tavern for his customary small measure of whiskey. Instead, he went straight to his room, lit the solitary lamp, and took out his saved coins. They amounted to $73.14, a considerable sum, painstakingly saved, enough to see him through the winter comfortably. But Thomas no longer sought comfort. He sat for hours, not counting the coins, but studying the map he had clipped from a 2-week-old newspaper, a crudely drawn line snaking across a blank expanse labeled unexplored. It was a journey of over 2,000 miles, a monstrous distance marked only by a few faint dots: Independence, Fort Laramie, and the Dalles. The decision was not of logic. It was a fever of the spirit. He was not running away from Cincinnati. He was running toward the man he believed he was meant to be, a man defined by wilderness and necessity, not by the thickness of a merchant's wallet or the size of his ledger. 3 days later, Thomas sold his tools, his precious inheritance as a cooper, to a rival shop owner for a fraction of their worth. He didn't care. He sold his meager furniture, his extra clothes, everything that tied him to his life as Thomas Hale, the Cincinnati cooper. He kept only the essentials: his strongest boots, a heavy woolen blanket, a few pieces of sturdy cookware, his Bible, now empty of the coins, and the small old hunting rifle his father had left him. With the money, he purchased the single most important possession for the road, a large, strong-backed mule named Goliath for its disproportionately small size, and a canvas-covered wagon, a true prairie schooner, not of the best quality, but stout enough to hold a few sacks of cornmeal, salt, coffee, and a small supply of axle grease. He wrote a brief, formal letter to his landlady, paid his final week of rent, and left the key on the dresser. He did not write to Arthur or anyone else. Goodbyes, he felt, were a chain forged in sentiment, and he needed to break every link. On the 3rd day of March, 1845, before the first bell of morning mass had rung out over the city, Thomas Hale walked Goliath and his small wagon out of the confines of Cincinnati. The air was biting cold, the streets still slick with the last melting snow of winter. He headed west, not along the river, but northwest, toward the starting line of the Great Migration, Independence, Missouri. As he cleared the last cluster of city buildings, leaving behind the soot and the suffocating sense of settled, he stopped and looked back. The city was a gray, huddled mass, its church spires reaching up like grasping, judgmental fingers. He felt a sudden, powerful lightness, a sensation not unlike shedding a second skin. The road ahead was a rutted track of mud and ice, flanked by leafless trees and silent fields. It promised nothing but hardship, risk, and the very real chance of failure, disease, and death. Yet as he turned his face toward the cold, sharp wind blowing from the direction of the setting sun, Thomas Hale finally understood the true meaning of the word free. The siren call of the West was not a song of riches, but a melody of self-creation. The 2,000 miles of unforgiving wilderness were merely the anvil upon which a man could be hammered into something new, something greater. He fixed his gaze on the horizon, pulled the brim of his hat low, and urged Goliath forward. The first step had been taken, and the old life was already fading into the smoke of memory. He was Thomas Hale Pioneer. The Unforgiving Trail awaited.
A final farewell to familiar shores. The plan, Thomas had decided, was to leave clean. No sentiment, no lingering glances, no promises he couldn't keep. Sentiment was the anchor that had chained his family to the stony soil of Pennsylvania for 3 generations, and he was determined to be the one to finally cut the rope. The West demanded ruthlessness, he reasoned, and the greatest ruthlessness a man could practice was against his own soft heart. Yet his resolve was tested not by the city's gray grip, but by a small, insistent tapping on his rented door the night before his planned departure. It was Clara. His younger sister, barely 20, stood framed in the dim lamplight of the hallway, her face pale with the cold and the knowledge she carried. Her shawl was pulled tight, and in her small gloved hands she clutched a jar of apple preserves, a foolish, sweet offering against the 2,000 miles of wilderness he was about to face. "You weren't going to tell me," she whispered, her voice dangerously steady. She didn't weep. Clara had long ago mastered the art of holding her sorrow within a tight, unyielding knot. Thomas stepped back, letting her into the small, stripped room. The air smelled of dust and unfulfilled expectation. All his worldly goods were already packed into the canvas-covered wagon he'd parked at the edge of the city. The room was a hollow shell, and her presence made the emptiness ache. "I didn't want to cause a fuss, Clara," he mumbled, closing the door and plunging them into near darkness, save for the single tallow candle. "I've settled my affairs. I'm leaving for Missouri at first light." "Missouri, or Oregon, or China, for all the notice you gave." Her voice rose a notch, betraying the raw hurt. "You are our blood, Thomas, our last name. How could you pack your bags and sell your trade without a word?" Thomas avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the jar of preserves. "My trade was a life sentence, Clara. Look around this city. Every street corner has a cooper. Every barrel is cheaper than the last. I would have spent my life making things for other men to fill with their riches. I will not die here, scraping dust." "And you think dying on the trail is better?" she countered, stepping closer. "Mother and father, they wouldn't have understood this haste." The mention of their deceased parents was the lash he deserved. He turned to her,
his voice low and fierce. "They were good people, Clara, but they were small. They lived small, and they died small. They believed a man must stay put, work hard, and wait for God's grace. I intend to meet God halfway, out where the country hasn't been fenced in yet." He saw the fear in her eyes, mixed with a painful admiration. Clara, forced to take a position as a seamstress to survive, dreamed of a life beyond the monotonous stitchwork, but lacked the raw nerve to pursue it. "I am the only family you have left in the East," she pleaded. "If you go, what am I to do?" This was the emotional knot he couldn't cut clean. He sat down on the empty floor, gesturing for her to join him. She lowered herself onto her knees, the preserves resting between them like a fragile truce. "You are strong, Clara. You have a skill. You can make your own way just as I must make mine. But listen to me, and listen well, because this is the last advice you will hear from me in this lifetime." He spent the next half hour not on a farewell, but on an intense, focused, logistical, and financial briefing. This was the language of survival, the only true comfort he could offer. He dictated the exact location of the few remaining family heirlooms, a silver locket, his father's watch, which were stored with a distant, trusted cousin. He explained the small insurance policy he had taken out in their mother's name, designating Clara as the sole beneficiary should the worst befall her. He even detailed the most efficient way to haggle with the chandler over the price of lamp oil. "And finally," he said, taking a deep breath, "I have left $200 with Mrs. O'Malley at the church. It is to be given to you in $10 installments once a month. You are to use it for no foolishness, only to supplement your board and to save. When you have enough for passage to Chicago or St. Louis, you are to go." Clara stared at him, tears finally blurring her vision. "You paid a stranger to look after me?" "I paid her to hold my anchor," Thomas corrected gently. "I paid her to give you a ladder, not a crutch. Do not waste it waiting for a man to save you. Save yourself. The East is for those who accept boundaries. You are a Hale, and we do not." The moment was fractured, a painful fusion of love and necessity. He took the jar of preserves. The apples were tart, perfectly sealed. A gift of nourishment, a final, tangible piece of home. "Thank you, Clara. I will not forget this." She stood up, her silhouette trembling in the candlelight. "I will pray you find what you're looking for, Thomas, but I pray harder that you find your way back to who you are." She didn't wait for a reply, didn't demand a hug. She simply turned and left, her small, solitary steps fading down the hall. Thomas sat for a long time in the dark, the preserves heavy in his hand. The weight of her solitude felt greater than the weight of the entire wagon. He had forced her into an independence she wasn't ready for, and the knowledge was a bitter aftertaste to the heady draft of his freedom. The West demands a sacrifice, he thought, and Clara was mine. The remaining hours before dawn were purely logistical, a frantic and meticulous preparation that served as a distraction from the farewell. Thomas, driven by a cold, calculating anxiety, checked his supplies for the 10th time. His wagon, a modified light farm conveyance, was a masterpiece of necessity. He had reinforced the wheel axles with iron braces, bought cheap from a blacksmith who thought he was mad. He had waterproofed the canvas cover with linseed oil and wax, turning it into a fortress against the coming spring rains. The load itself was distributed with the care of a sea captain preparing for a typhoon. The provisions, the fuel of the dream. Food was paramount. He estimated the trip to Independence would take 6 to 8 weeks, during which he couldn't rely on purchasing staples. Flour and hardtack, 2 large sacks of coarse flour wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. He had spent an entire day baking large quantities of hardtack, flat, dry biscuits that would break teeth but never spoil. These were stacked neatly in a wooden box, his primary sustenance. Cured meats and salt. 3 slabs of salted pork, carefully wrapped in canvas. The salt itself was a treasure, a small barrel of rock salt, essential for curing meat on the trail and a vital component for his mule's health. Coffee and sugar. Coffee beans, unground, were stored in a repurposed tobacco tin, sealed with wax. Sugar, a luxury, was kept to a minimum, just enough to sweeten the coffee and fortify him on the worst days. Gardening seeds. Tucked into the bottom of the salt barrel, Thomas had placed a small, tightly tied linen bag. Inside were the seeds of his future: wheat, corn, carrots, and beans. They were the most valuable things he owned, the potential for a self-sufficient life in Oregon. Manifest destiny was not just about claiming land, it was about planting it.
The tools and trade, the means of self-reliance. Thomas had lost his cooper's tools, but he was still a craftsman, and the West required a man to be a jack of all trades. The rifle. His father's hunting rifle, a reliable muzzleloader, was broken down, oiled, and wrapped securely in his woolen blanket. He had 30 pounds of lead shot and 2 pounds of gunpowder, stored separately in watertight containers, fully aware that a single spark could end his journey before it began. Blacksmithing kit, a small portable forge, and a hammer. This was his great advantage. Most pioneers relied on forts for repairs. Thomas intended to be self-sufficient. His small kit included several lengths of iron rod, a file, and a pair of tongs, enough to patch a broken axle or shoe Goliath if needed. This kit alone weighed a daunting 60 pounds. Coopering essentials. Though he sold his large tools, he kept a small draw knife and a set of chisels. A cooper's skill was vital on the trail. Barrels and wooden containers were the bloodline of the journey, and the ability to repair them was essential. Medical supplies. A single pouch containing rudimentary supplies, Lonidine for pain, quinine for fevers, a costly purchase, and clean bandages. He had bought a small book on frontier doctoring, which he planned to study diligently. The wagon and the mule, the engine of the enterprise. His mule, Goliath, was the true key to success. Thomas had spent more time and money on Goliath than on himself. Harness and rigging. He personally inspected every leather strap of the harness. A broken harness meant a stalled wagon, and a stalled wagon on the trail was a death sentence. He carried spare leather and a sturdy owl for repairs. Axle grease, a bucket of rendered animal fat mixed with pine tar, essential for preventing the axles from overheating and snapping. He topped off the grease boxes, knowing the friction of the miles ahead would consume it rapidly. Water barrels. He had fashioned 2 small, sturdy oak barrels, his finest piece of secret, unpaid work, which were strapped to the wagon sides. Clean water was his greatest concern, and the barrels, freshly lined with pitch, were ready to be filled at the last moment.
As the first streaks of sickly yellow light began to paint the eastern sky, Thomas stood back, his breath misting in the cold air. The wagon was loaded to the limit, its contents a dense, tightly packed monument to his singular ambition. It weighed nearly 2,000 pounds, a crushing burden for a single mule, even a strong one like Goliath. He knew the risk of overburdening was high, but every item seemed necessary, a non-negotiable insurance policy against the chaos of the West. He pulled the leather bridle over Goliath's head. The mule stamped its feet, sensing the change, the unusual hour, the cold, silent streets. "We go now, old friend," Thomas murmured, patting the mule's muscular flank. "To Missouri first, to Independence, then to the jumping-off point, where the real world ends and the map begins." The journey from Cincinnati to Independence was itself a grueling preamble,
a cultural and geographical transition that stripped away the last vestiges of his Eastern identity. He traveled mostly through the states of Indiana and Illinois, where the roads were little more than packed earth tracks that turned to impassable quagmires with the slightest rain. This was the country of the established Midwest, small, tidy farms, clustered communities of German and Scots-Irish immigrants, and a populace that viewed his westward quest with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Oregon, you say?" a tavern peeper in Vincennes had sneered. "We've got good land right here, son, green and waiting. You'll die out there, lost to the heat and the savage. Mark my words." Thomas had paid for his cornmeal and left in silence. Their warnings were the whispers of the defeated, the ones who had stopped their journey too soon, content with the half-promised land of the Ohio Valley. He found strength in their doubt. It validated the exceptional nature of his ambition. He spent weeks navigating the frozen, often hostile landscape of the Midwest. He was forced to sell a few non-essential items, an extra shovel, a book of poetry, for feed for Goliath when the winter grazing failed. Each sale was a small, necessary defeat, a reminder that the trail would continue to strip him of everything unnecessary. The heavy, formal suit he had brought was the first to go, traded for a coarse, durable hunting shirt and buckskin trousers, the uniform of the West he was slowly becoming. As he neared the Mississippi River, the landscape changed dramatically. The small, neat woodlots gave way to vast, flat prairies, a precursor of the plains to come. The villages became sparser, the people harder looking, more transient. Crossing the Mississippi at St. Louis was a momentous occasion, a psychological and literal divide. He paid the ferryman, watching the great river, the artery of the continent, flow south, a dark, powerful current that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of his undertaking. Once across, he was in the state of Missouri, the gateway to the West. He was no longer a traveler, he was a pioneer. The final leg to independence was a stretch of feverish activity. Independence, Missouri was a vortex of chaos and excitement, the last civilized outpost before the great emptiness. The town was swollen with emigrants, speculators, merchants, and mountain men, all clamoring for supplies and space. The main street was a cacophony of wagon wheels, barking dogs, swearing teamsters, and the constant, mournful braying of thousands of newly purchased livestock. Here, Thomas had to undertake the final critical logistical task, assembling his team. He couldn't make the entire journey alone. He needed people, for mutual defense, for sharing the watch, for the sheer labor of the road. He spent 3 days observing the crowds, listening to the conversations in the noisy taverns and around the smoky fires of the wagon camps. He watched for faces that showed not just hope, but grit, for eyes that were clear, not clouded by romantic delusion or desperation. He needed partners, not dependents. It was in a cluttered supply store, haggling over the price of a canvas bucket, that he found his first prospect. A man named Elias Vance, a carpenter by trade, broad and taciturn, with a young wife and 2 small children. Elias had a sturdy 4-yoke wagon and a professional air of competence, but lacked a reliable hunter or a man experienced with smithing and repair. Thomas approached him directly, cutting through the pleasantries. "I have a mule, a set of tools that can mend a wagon, and a rifle that can bring down a deer. What I lack is a family to share the watch with. I traveled to the Willamette. Do you travel true?" Elias, judging Thomas's lean, focused intensity, and seeing the valuable draw knife tucked into his belt, nodded slowly. "I travel true, but I lack a reliable hand outside my own. My wife Sarah is a good woman, but she cannot drive the yoke and mend a wheel at the same time. You are welcome to our fire on 2 conditions. You share in all labor and all guard duty, and you agree to follow the wagon master's rule, whatever it may be." Thomas accepted the terms immediately. He was not looking for command, but for competence. The following morning, Thomas brought Goliath and his wagon to the Vances' camp on the outskirts of Independence. The Vances had a small tent pitched behind their wagon. Sarah Vance, a woman with a strong jaw and capable hands, offered Thomas a cup of coffee. It was weak and bitter, but it was a gesture of acceptance, a new bond being forged. "Welcome to the start of the wilderness, Mr. Hale," she said, her eyes steady. "No turning back now." Looking at the thousands of wagons gathering, the massive tide of humanity about to wash west, Thomas felt a final crushing wave of the old life recede. His goodbye to Clara was final. His break from Cincinnati was complete. He was now fully immersed in the logistics of survival, tied to a new, tentative family, ready to face the unforgiving trail. He took a long drink of the coffee. "No, Mrs. Vance," he replied, feeling the hard confidence of the pioneer settle over him. He reached into his wagon and took out the jar of Clara's apple preserves. It was the only item that did not belong in the wilderness, the only piece of the East he still possessed. He handed it to Sarah Vance, whose eyes widened slightly at the sight of the preserved luxury. "For your children," Thomas said, his voice husky. "A small gift from my sister. May it give them strength when the road gets long." He had sold his history, but he had preserved his humanity, passing it on to the new world he was about to conquer. The logistics were complete, the emotional ledger settled. He was ready for the wilderness.
Joining the wagon train. The first true test of the westward venture was not the prairie, but the chaos of the staging grounds just outside of Independence, Missouri. It was here, in the vast muddy flats bordering the Missouri River, that Thomas Hale spent his next 5 days, utterly immersed in the organized frenzy of the assembling migration. The air was a thick mixture of dust, wood smoke, the acrid scent of nervous livestock, and the loud polyglot shouting of 1,000 souls preparing to abandon the familiar world. The camp was a temporary city of canvas and wheel, a raw, sprawling organism that represented the entirety of American ambition and desperation in the spring of 1845. The settlers were a study in contrasts. Prosperous families from Ohio and Illinois, whose wagons were sleek, newly painted, and overflowing with furniture and fine china. Rough-hewn German and Irish immigrants, carrying nothing but their tools and their fierce optimism. And lone, silent men like Thomas, whose meager, pragmatic loads spoke only of survival. Thomas, along with Elias Vance and his family, was now part of a loose cluster of nearly 50 wagons, all destined for the Oregon Territory. This congregation had, by necessity, begun to organize itself into a functional unit, a crucial life-saving step known as a wagon train. The sheer impossibility of surviving the long road alone had forced these disparate individuals to forge a temporary, high-stakes community. The election of the captain. The first and most crucial order of business was the election of a wagon master, or captain. The rules of the trail were simple: order or death. Without a single unchallenged authority, the train would dissolve into arguments, delays, and ultimately, disaster. The meeting was held on the third evening, a raucous affair around a massive central fire. Thomas stood beside Elias, observing the aspirants. Most were boisterous, self-declared leaders, men who spoke loudly about their land claims and their imagined prowess with a rifle. The frontrunner was a wealthy, bombastic former politician from Kentucky named Senator Silas Thorne. His wagon was pulled by 6 magnificent oxen, and his wife Penelope, already dressed in silk gowns that had no place on the trail, was holding court. "I say we move swift," Thorne bellowed, his voice accustomed to addressing crowds. "Any man who falls behind must be left. The wilderness rewards the decisive.
I will ensure discipline and speed, and I have mapped the route myself down to the last foot." His confidence was magnetic, but Thomas instinctively distrusted him. Thorne's eyes held the glint of self-interest, not service. He would sacrifice the common good for his own advantage. A counter-candidate emerged, nominated by a group of quiet farmers, Jedediah Stone. Stone was a man in his 50s, gaunt and weathered, a veteran of 2 trips on the Santa Fe Trail. He wore a simple, patched coat, and when he spoke, he did so without theatrics, just a plain, unvarnished recital of facts. "The map, Senator. The map is a piece of paper. The river crossings are the reality. I know the crossings. I know when a storm will hit based on the way the wind smells after a midday sun. I know how to mend a fever, and I know when a man is too sick to stand watch." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy. "I don't promise speed. I promise survival. I will leave no one behind until they are a certainty to die. We are one body on that trail. You can have the Senator's speed and his shiny oxen, or you can have my knowledge. Vote as you choose." The choice was agonizingly clear to those who understood the severity of the trip, the flashy speed of a politician versus the grim competence of a veteran. Thomas cast his vote for Jedediah Stone, as did Elias. When the tallies were counted, a simple raising of hands, Jedediah Stone won by a narrow margin. He was now the captain, and his first act was to silence Senator Thorne's immediate protests with a cold, simple declaration. "You obey the rules of the train, Senator, or you are free to ride alone." The formation of the cohort. With the captain established, Thomas was officially integrated into the train. He and the Vances were assigned to a small cohort, a group of 5 wagons that would travel and camp together for security and mutual aid. This cohort became his immediate, essential universe. Their small group was a microcosm of the entire American ambition and desperation. The Vance family, Elias, Sarah, and 2 children, the anchor of Thomas's group. Elias, the methodical carpenter, was a man of quiet faith and endless patience, excellent with wood and structural repairs. Sarah was Thomas's first connection to shared domestic life since Clara left. She could stretch a small ration of beans into a full meal and knew more about herbal remedies than any doctor. The Blackwoods, Robert and Elizabeth, a young, recently married couple from Pennsylvania. They were the romantic idealists. Robert, only 22, had given up a lucrative inheritance for the freedom of the frontier. Their wagon was too heavy, filled with impractical items, a full-size dressing mirror, several boxes of books, and an expensive fiddle. They lacked the practical skills for the trail, but brought an infectious, if naive, optimism. Thomas knew they were the most likely to break, but their eagerness to learn was a benefit. Mrs. Esther Jenkins and her nephew, Caleb, the dark horse of the group. Esther, a widow in her 60s, was traveling to join a son already established in California. She drove a light, spare wagon pulled by 2 ancient but durable mules. She spoke little, only in sharp, cutting observations. Caleb, her 18-year-old nephew, was utterly useless with a gun or an ox, but possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of botany and local medicinal plants, a strange, invaluable skill. Esther's motive was clear, her own survival, driven by a steely, quiet will. The lone rider, Doc Healy. Not officially part of the cohort, but always hovering near. Healy was a former Army surgeon who claimed to be traveling to establish a practice in the West. He was older, with a haunted look, and possessed a full leather satchel of medical instruments. He had no wagon, only a fine horse and a pack mule laden with supplies. He paid for his place in the train by offering medical services, but his reserved nature made him an enigma. He was the only man Thomas encountered who seemed to be running from something rather than towards something. Establishing the dynamics, trust, and competence. In the final days before the departure, the dynamics of the cohort were established through the merciless metrics of competence. No one cared about social status or past wealth. They cared only about who could mend a wheel, fetch clean water, or track a stray ox.
The test of the axle. One afternoon, as the men were practicing hitching the teams, the axle on Robert Blackwood's overladen wagon cracked with a sickening splinter. Robert, pale and frantic, rushed to Thomas, who was busy shoeing Goliath. "Hale, for God's sake, you are the cooper. Can you mend it?" Thomas did not reply immediately. He finished driving the last nail into Goliath's hoof, tested the shoe, and then slowly walked over to the crippled wagon. He ran his hand over the splintered wood, assessing the damage, a long, deep fissure where the load had proven too great for the green timber. "I can mend it," Thomas said, pulling his draw knife from his belt, "but not here. We need heat and iron." Then he looked pointedly at Robert's load. "The mirror, the books, the velvet chairs, they break the axle, not the road. If you intend to take that to Oregon, we will break every 2 weeks. You must lighten the load, now." This was the first great confrontation. Robert protested, citing his wife's comfort. "Your wife will be comfortable dying," Thomas cut in, his voice cold. "The trail will not care for her velvet. Choose, half your material comfort or all your life." It was Elias who broke the stalemate. "He's right, Robert. We all saw your wagon bounce. We'll help you rebuild the axle, but you must make the sacrifice. We cannot afford to wait for you." Under the combined pressure, Robert, tearfully, began tossing boxes out of his wagon. Elizabeth, standing beside him, did not cry. She simply and grimly pointed out which items they could truly live without. Thomas respected her practical clarity more than her husband's idealism. The incident served as a brutal, public lesson. The wagon train was a zero-sum game, and individual luxury was a threat to the collective. The watch and the rituals. Jedediah Stone, the newly elected captain, instituted the rules of the trail with an unnerving severity. His rules were memorized by every member, becoming a liturgy of survival. The circle. Every night, wagons were to be drawn into a tight circle, a corral for the livestock and a fortress against attack. The process was timed and practiced until it became a rapid, silent ritual. Guard duty. Every able-bodied man over 16 and every woman deemed competent was assigned a 4-hour watch shift. Thomas's solitary status meant he pulled extra shifts, a fact he accepted without complaint, preferring the quiet darkness to the endless chatter of the camp. The code of the trail. No firing of a weapon outside of an emergency. No abuse of livestock. No leaving the column without the captain's express permission. Above all, do not panic. Panic kills faster than thirst. Thomas found himself drawn into the captain's orbit. Jedediah, noticing Thomas's disciplined manner and his useful set of skills, often sought him out. "You're a quiet one, Hale," Jedediah observed one evening, sharpening his own hunting knife. "Most men out here talk a lot about what they're going to do. You talk about what you can do." "I was a cooper, Captain," Thomas replied, carefully checking the percussion caps on his rifle. "We focus on joints and seals. If the joints are weak, the whole structure fails." "Good. Then you understand this train is a barrel, and we've got a lot of weak staves." He pointed his knife toward Senator Thorne's camp, where a loud argument about a card game was underway. "Thorne thinks his money buys his way. It only buys him a bigger funeral. Your value is your ability to repair the road we break, Hale. Do not fail us." The captain's direct, brutal pragmatism solidified Thomas's role. He was the essential mechanic, the man whose hands could save a life by fixing a wheel. The emotional toll of waiting. Despite the feverish activity,
The endless days of waiting for the trail to dry and the full complement of the train to assemble took a hidden toll. The emotional goodbyes, the ones Thomas had thought he'd avoided, came in the form of letters that would now be their last contact with the East. In Independence, Thomas found a post office, the final stop for mail heading east. He purchased a small, precious sheet of paper and sat down to write to Clara. He couldn't send money as he had promised, but he sent words, a fragile, thin bond of ink. My dear Clara, I am in Independence now, the last stop. The scale of the undertaking is vast, and the men here are a terrifying mixture of fools and heroes. I have joined a good company under an old hand named Jedediah Stone. We leave soon. I have sold the old suit. I have traded most of the things I deemed comfortable for things that are useful. Every day here is a lesson in letting go of what you think you need. Do not mourn me, Clara, but envy me. I am building a future, not from the leftovers of another man's inheritance, but from my own two hands. I have entrusted the locket and the watch to the cousin. Trust the churchwoman with the payments. Do not write back to this place. When I have landed, I will send word through the only way possible, a man traveling east. Keep your chin high, and remember the words, save yourself. I pray we meet again in a country where the horizon is not a fence, but a promise. Your brother, Thomas. Sealing the letter with a drop of borrowed wax, he handed it to the postmaster. Watching the letter fall into the outbound bag, Thomas felt the true, final severing. It was a wrenching moment of vulnerability he had tried to suppress, a recognition that he might never see his sister's face again. He was now a blank slate, his entire identity wrapped in the few possessions strapped to Goliath's back. The dawn of departure. Finally, on a clear, cool morning in mid-May, the captain gave the order. The air was electric, a mixture of terror and immense relief. The days of preparation were over. The waiting was done. The train, 52 wagons strong, slowly unwound itself from the confusion of the camp and formed a long serpentine column. Jedediah Stone, mounted on a sturdy bay horse, rode to the front, his profile grim and resolute. Thomas, driving Goliath, took his place third in his cohort of 5, just behind Elias Vance. The sound was deafening, the heavy, rhythmic creak of ungreased axles, the relentless clack-clack of wheels on hard earth, the deep, guttural cries of the oxen drivers, and the panicked bleating of the livestock.
As they cleared the last row of buildings in Independence, the world changed. The neat, fenced fields of Missouri gave way to the endless, undulating green of the prairie. The vastness was immediate and overwhelming. The horizon, once just a distant line in a book, now stretched out in all directions, a dizzying, terrifying promise. Thomas looked ahead at the dozens of wagons in front of him, each canvas cover billowing with a white sail on a great grassy ocean. He was one insignificant joint in a massive, fragile machine. The success of his own small dream was now entirely dependent on the discipline of the whole, the competence of the captain, and the resilience of his newly formed cohort, the Vances, the idealistic Blackwoods, the silent Mrs. Jenkins, and the haunted Doc Healy. He felt the rough wooden reins of Goliath's harness in his hands, the weight of the wagon pressing against the mule, and the strange, fierce exhilaration of movement. The familiar shores were gone. He was on the unforgiving trail now, and the first lesson was already learned. To survive, a man must trade comfort for competence, and solitude for a binding, desperate faith in the stranger driving the wagon next to his own. The real journey, the real test of his soul, had begun.
The Great Plains, endless horizon. The transition from the tight, muddy confines of Independence
to the boundless expanse of the Great Plains was not merely geographical, it was an abrupt, psychological shattering. Within a week of leaving Missouri, the timbered landscapes and familiar rolling hills had vanished, replaced by a horizon so vast it seemed to mock the very notion of human measurement. This was a country built on impossible scale, where the sky was not merely a roof, but a colossal dome that dwarfed the long serpentine line of the wagon train below. The scale of the sublime. Thomas Hale, driving his mule Goliath, often had prided himself on his keen eye, honed by years of assessing the grain and flaw in wood. But here, the eye was useless. The distance played tricks, warping perception until reality felt like a mirage. A small dust cloud on the horizon might be a band of Indians, a buffalo herd, or simply a trick of the wind 50 miles away. Landmarks, like the distant solitary mound known as Chimney Rock, would appear to hover in the distance for days, in agonizingly slow progress that mocked the rhythm of his steps. The initial awe was visceral. For a man who had lived his life confined by city streets and the four walls of a cooper's shop, the endless horizon was a terrifying kind of freedom. There were no fences, no landmarks, no familiar sounds, only the perpetual wind and the immense, silent, green and gold ocean of grass. "It's not land, Thomas," Elias Vance observed one evening, his voice hushed as he watched the sunset. "It's a feeling, like the world hasn't been finished yet." Thomas understood. The land demanded that the emigrant constantly reorient himself, not just geographically, but morally and spiritually. In the city, he knew his place. Here, his place was wherever his 2 feet stood, and the rest was an immensity waiting to swallow him whole. This was the first and most profound challenge of the trail, conquering the fear that came from being so infinitesimally small. The daily grind, the tyranny of routine. The romantic vision of the frontier was quickly beaten down by the tyranny of the daily routine. Captain Jedediah Stone enforced a schedule that was as unforgiving as the landscape. The day began not with the sun, but an hour before it, with the crack of Jedediah's rifle, the morning gun. 5 a.m., the start. Instantly, the camp erupted into controlled chaos. Women began cooking, men rushed to find the oxen which had grazed free overnight. Children fetched water. Breakfast was brief and boiled. Coffee, a slab of dry bacon, and cold hardtack. 6 a.m., forming the column. Wagons were pulled out of the defensive circle and hitched into a single file. The captain was ruthless about punctuality. Any delay risked leaving a wagon behind, a threat that kept everyone moving with desperate efficiency. 7 a.m. to noon, the morning march. The pace was slow, averaging barely 2 miles an hour. Thomas walked alongside Goliath, his hand resting on the mule's flank, learning the rhythm of the journey. The dust was the constant companion, fine, silk-like powder that invaded lungs, eyes, and provisions, turning every wagon and person a uniform shade of tan. Noon, the short rest. The train halted for an hour. The livestock were watered and allowed a brief graze. The humans ate cold rations. There was no time to build a fire. 1 p.m. to 5 p.m., the afternoon pull. The sun was at its zenith, the heat oppressive, often reaching over 100 degrees. This was the hardest shift, where tempers frayed and the dust became a choking, blinding menace. 5 p.m., the night camp. The captain selected the campsite, always near water if possible. The wagons immediately formed the circle.
The men unyoked the tired animals. The women, utterly exhausted, began the process of building fires, boiling water, and preparing the one substantial meal of the day: bean soup, cornmeal mush, or, on a lucky night, fresh game. Thomas excelled in this environment. His discipline, learned in the monotony of the cooper's shop, now served him well. He was tireless in his watch shifts and meticulous in the care of Goliath, constantly rubbing down the mule and checking the harness for chafing. However, the sheer physical toll began to show on his cohort. The failures of the cohort. The easygoing Blackwoods were the first to stumble. Robert, the romantic, soon realized that freedom from a lucrative inheritance meant endless, back-breaking labor. His wife, Elizabeth, discovered that her books were a burden, not a comfort. It was the water rationing that broke them. When the train was forced to march 2 days through a dry, barren stretch, the captain imposed strict limits. The Blackwoods, accustomed to excess, were the first to complain. "My wife is feeling unwell. She needs more water than the rest," Robert shouted at Thomas one afternoon, brandishing an empty canteen. "She gets her share, Robert, and no more," Thomas said, tightening the spigot on the water barrel. "Your wife's discomfort is no greater than the 5 children in the next wagon who also go thirsty. If you waste it now, you die later. That's the only rule that matters." The argument simmered, an ugly, small-minded display against the backdrop of the massive, indifferent sky. Robert's eyes, once full of idealistic light, were now clouded with resentment. He lacked the inner fortitude to meet the reality of the trail. The quiet resiliences. In contrast, Thomas witnessed the astonishing resilience of the women. Sarah Vance, Elias's wife, was a tireless engine of domestic order. While Elias labored with the oxen, Sarah managed their 2 toddlers, washed clothes in the meager river water, and cared for Thomas's small portion of laundry with quiet efficiency. One night, finding Thomas sitting alone studying his frontier doctoring book by firelight, Sarah brought him a small piece of cornbread, freshly baked. "You've been helping Elias shoe the oxen late, Mr. Hale. A man must eat." "Thank you, Mrs. Vance," Thomas replied, genuinely touched. "You never stop working." "If you stop working, you stop living," she said simply, her face illuminated by the flame, etched with exhaustion and determination. "That's the difference between this land and the East, Mr. Hale. Out here, you can't buy leisure. You earn it every minute of the day." And then there was Esther Jenkins, the elderly widow. She never asked for help. She drove her 2 old mules, walked beside them with a straight back, and managed her useless nephew Caleb with sharp, precise commands. She was a silent judgment on the rest of the cohort, a living testament to the fact that sheer will could conquer age and physical frailty. The first encounters. Buffalo and beauty. The trail was not just a slog of work, it offered flashes of an unearthly beauty that justified the entire insane undertaking. These moments were intoxicating, proving the whispers of the siren call true.
One afternoon, the entire train came to a halt on the crest of a low rise. Before them, filling the entire visible valley, was a buffalo herd. It was not dozens or hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of the great beasts, a dark, moving carpet that stretched to the horizon, shaking the very ground with their massive collective presence. The sight was overwhelming, a primal, untamed spectacle of nature that no man from the civilized East could have ever conceived. The silence was broken only by the distant, deep roar of the herd. For a brief, suspended moment, the entire wagon train, from the captain to the smallest child, stood in hushed reverence. It was a vision of the unclaimed bounty, a realization of the raw, wild power that America still held. Jedediah Stone organized the hunt immediately. Fresh meat was a luxury that could not be ignored. Thomas, with his father's reliable rifle, was chosen along with 3 other competent marksmen. The hunt was a desperate, adrenaline-fueled sprint. They rode out, skirting the edge of the immense herd. The danger was not the buffalo itself, but the possibility of a stampede which could flatten the hunters or crash through the wagon train miles away. Thomas sighted a large bull, a beast of immense power, separating slightly from the main group. He dismounted quickly, his heart hammering in his chest, and took aim, forcing his hands to be steady despite the pounding of the ground. He remembered his father's lesson. "Don't shoot for the head, Thomas. Shoot for the lungs. One shot, or you lose the meat." The muzzleloader cracked, a solitary sharp sound that was instantly swallowed by the immensity of the plain. The bull stumbled, recovered, then slowly sank to his knees. A single, perfect shot. Returning to the camp with the quartered meat, Thomas felt a pride he had never known in his cooper's life. He had not just worked, he had provided. He had met the wilderness on its own terms and won. The fresh meat, distributed to every family, lifted the morale of the entire train, a collective sigh of relief and celebration. The shadow of native presence. The vastness and the buffalo were intoxicating, but the shadow of native presence was a constant low-level anxiety. The train was crossing land that belonged to the Pawnee, the Cheyenne, and the Sioux, nations that regarded the constant stream of white wagons as a pestilence, consuming the grass and scaring off the buffalo. Jedediah Stone was adamant about maintaining a posture of caution, not aggression. "We are guests on this land," he told the men. "Unwanted guests. We move fast, we keep our word, and we do not steal or provoke. Only fire when your life or the life of a companion is threatened." The first encounter was not a battle, but a silent negotiation. One afternoon, a small band of mounted Pawnee appeared on a bluff overlooking the trail. They made no aggressive move. They simply watched the column of 52 wagons pass. They were magnificent figures, their faces painted, their posture proud and unmoving. Panic rippled through the train. Senator Forn immediately drew his pistol and screamed for the column to halt. "Prepare to fire! Stand your ground!" Jedediah, without breaking his stride, rode back and leveled his rifle at Thorn's head. "Put that weapon away, Senator, or I'll shoot you myself. You do not start a war over observation." Jedediah then rode forward alone, raising his hand in the universal gesture of peace. The Pawnee leader returned the gesture. They spoke for several tense minutes, a silent exchange of gestures, a transfer of small gifts, a piece of tobacco from Jedediah, a buffalo hide from the Pawnee. When Jedediah returned, he was grim. "They are angry. They say we are eating the grass meant for the herds. They permit us to pass this time, but demand we move swiftly and leave no damage." The incident was a brutal lesson in diplomacy. The trail was not an empty playground. It was a complex, contested territory. Thomas realized that the greatest threat on the prairie was not just the physical environment, but the constant need for political discipline and respect, the very things many of the emigrants, especially men like Thorn, were incapable of offering. The inevitable sorrow. The Great Plains exacted a price beyond labor and fear. It demanded lives. They had been on the trail for 25 days when the cholera struck. It was a stealthy, cruel killer. It started with a woman in the rearmost wagon, a sudden, violent fever, followed by rapid dehydration. Within 24 hours, she was dead. By the time the train was alerted, 2 more children were symptomatic. Panic, the enemy Jedediah Stone had warned against, finally erupted. Families tried to pull away from the main column, desperate to escape the contagion. The air was thick with the terror of an unseen enemy. Doc Healy, the enigmatic former surgeon, finally stepped into his true role. He organized a small temporary hospital far from the main camp. Thomas, whose steady hands were useful, was recruited to assist. "The quinine is mostly useless for this strain," Healy explained, his face drawn. "We must keep them clean, keep them warm, and try to force-feed them water, which they will instantly lose. It is a losing fight, Hale." They fought for 3 days. The stench of sickness was pervasive. Thomas witnessed death up close for the first time, a slow, agonizing disappearance. He saw the strength of Sarah Vance, who risked contagion to assist Healy with the sick children. He saw the useless, weeping hysteria of Senator Thorne's wife, Penelope, who insisted the illness was a punishment from God. In the end, 4 lives were lost, the initial woman and 3 children. The bodies had to be buried quickly and deeply, their graves dug in the middle of the trail, the entire train driven over the fresh earth to obscure the location from predators and perhaps more tragically, from the eyes of the bereaved. The captain would tolerate no markers that might tempt grave robbers or attract the notice of passing native groups. The burials were grim, silent affairs, ceremonies stripped to their rawest essentials. As Thomas helped Elias shovel dirt over a small, blanket-wrapped body, he looked out at the unending green. The landscape, once awe-inspiring, now felt cold and indifferent, a magnificent, beautiful killer. The Great Plains had given them sublime views and fresh buffalo meat. It had also given them the crushing weight of their own mortality. Thomas realized that the true journey west was not about covering miles, it was about accepting this duality, the terrifying beauty and the constant, imminent threat of annihilation. He tightened his grip on the shovel, a grim acknowledgement that the trail was not just an adventure, but a test of will, ruthlessly purging the weak, the unready, and the unlucky. The journey continued.